Assalamu alaikum. Joining us today on the Progeny podcast is my dear friend Sheikh Mohammed Al-Hilli, scholar, speaker and author, and inshallah there's lots to speak about on today's show. The youth and their identity today, as well as the many challenges they face. We'll speak about the role of speakers and scholars, the role of women in our communities, as well as, interestingly, Sheikh Mohammed Hilli's preparations for the holy month of Muharram. Thank you, Sheikhna, for joining us. Lots to speak about in this podcast. So I want to crack on first with asking you about the youth. Firstly, because you're a youthful Sheikh. Secondly, because you are involved with the different communities. I'm talking all the way in Australia, here in the United Kingdom, all parts of the UK you've traveled to, and the US, Canada, North America, and other parts of the world, including parts of Africa, which I know you were during the holy month of Ramadan. How different would you say, and of course you were brought up in this country, so how different would you think the youth are today from 20 years ago?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you so much. I'm not sure I agree that I'm a youthful person now. The grey hairs on my head are testimony to the fact that I've kind of moved on, although you know, it's an honor to be able to be grouped amongst the youth. It's a very interesting question because I think most of us are seeing the transition, seeing the so-called paradigm shift that we are witnessing in this day and age. What is very intriguing is that every generation has its own patterns, has its own trends and kind of areas that they focus on. But today there's been perhaps a change towards modernization that I would classify as a huge step towards making life somehow easy to practice and live. I think if I was to at the outset really kind of summarize the major difference that we witness today is the need for people to somehow have an easier life in all aspects, in all its dimensions. From
so not just religious.
No, not just religious, but in every aspect. Technology is making people's lives, progressively easy, and so this has affected people's outlook towards how they conduct themselves. In my humble opinion, my forefathers, all our forefathers and grandfathers used to live a much more difficult life than we are living today. Their struggles were much more in the sense that they had to endure a lot more hardship in attaining what they wish to attain. Whereas today we're used to a lifestyle where we get things the click of a button, and therefore that has resulted in less patience. It's resulted in, just as an example, I know it's a kind of religious example, but if you look at Hajj, for example, in this pilgrimage, if you compare the pilgrimage today from how it was in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s and even the 90s, my first pilgrimage was in 1998, and when I compare it with 2019 is a huge difference because, you look at the facilitation of services out there, you look at, for example, air conditioning everywhere, you look at the availability of water, you look at, for example, the transport. Everything's changed. That doesn't necessarily indicate it's a negative factor. However, the problem that I think we are encountering is that given this modernization and technological advances, the key area of the spiritual progression of our youth, their development, has also had a major hit. Simply because people want pocket-size, bite-size information. They're not willing to pick up a book now as much. Publishers, libraries, people who have books at home are complaining. They're saying, my kids don't read anymore. They're on their phones. Their concentration spans are so short now. So it's just as an example that we're moving towards a trend where people want things given to them on a plate. They don't want to necessarily fight or struggle or endure a little bit of a hardship to develop They want things, and it's affecting, for example, marital relationships, an area that I'm quite, heavily involved. I see couples a lot of the time, and when I hear about some of their complaints, I wonder, if the same issues were faced by, couples 30, 40 years ago, will have huge divorce rates at that time. People were willing to
They were more patient.
Yeah, they were willing to encounter so much more than people today.
Do you think that's got to do with the identity of Muslims in the West today? I mean, you mentioned our forefathers or our grandparents, or the Iraqi, maybe this is the second generation, for other communities third maybe, but their identity was built in where they came from. So whether it was Najaf, Karbala, Kadhimain, religious cities, or even Iraq, Iran, wherever they came from, their identity was built there, and then they came. Their identity had already been built. Whereas maybe today, your identity is being built around social media, if that makes sense. Does that affect the challenges that the youth face?
I think the first problem that the youth face with regards to who they are is that they don't know who they are. To start off with, you mentioned a very good point that perhaps back in the time it was much more clear in the mindset of people, their belonging, their cultural affiliations, their affinity with their religion. Today, I genuinely believe that there is a clash of identities and an identity crisis that some of our youth are encountering. When you speak to them, for example, they'll tell you they're comfortable with their Muslim identity in Islamic settings. But in outside world, when push comes to shove, due to Islamophobia, due to racism, due to fear of, their lives, especially females, for example, they tend to become a little bit more reluctant to somehow present themselves with that form of identity. So there is a crisis out there. I did a number of interesting experiments or discussions in America and here, where I grouped, the youths in different age categories, but mostly between 16 and 35. And I asked them, would you identify yourself as British? Would you identify yourself as Muslim? Would you identify yourself as Muslim British, British Muslim, Shia Iraqi, Iraqi British Shia Muslim, and all these different kind of labels, so to speak. And it was very interesting seeing their responses. And one of the things that emerged from these kind of experiments is that people would identify themselves differently in accordance with the environment that they're in and the pressures that they're in. So if they're with their fathers and if they're with their community, they wouldn't necessarily be reluctant to say, I'm an Iraqi, or I'm a Pakistani, or I'm Khoja. Whereas when they're with their friends at university, their so-called Britishness, their Americanness, Canadianness, Aussiness, all these kind of things emerge much more. And so we are, at a crossroads, perhaps.
That's a real problem then, if from what you're saying, and obviously you mentioned different parts of the world. The problem is then they're going to end up with what, different personalities when they're in university, then when they're in the mosque. Yeah. What's the challenges you end up facing when you have different identities? Because I feel the problem would be isn't that being, I don't know if that's the right word, but you're being a hypocrite maybe?
Well,
maybe that's too
in a way what it does, it creates this conflict in the mindset of a youth as to exactly how am I going to lead my life in accordance with type of instruction or principles or governance. So if I'm not comfortable with my Muslim identity, and if I don't believe that it can be compatible with my British identity, then I may come to a point where one has to trump the other, or has to oversee the other, or become the dominant one.
Yeah.
If I'm with a group of friends, for example, and they are not non-Muslim, and there's males and females, and for example they start going into areas like bars and discos and clubs, or I'm in a car and they switch on the different types of music, hip-hop and so on. Here I am in a position of dilemma. Is my faith going to really emerge as something that is dominant in my life, or I want to fit in, I want to become part of this group? So peer pressure plays a role. So what it does, it creates a lot of dichotomy. Yes, it may result in hypocrisy, but what it certainly does is it clouds in the mindset of a youth what is exactly their responsibility, their duty, their vision. And that's why today there's been a lot of people who talk about the difficulty they have to distinguish between culture and religion, because culture has also made its way into a lot of practices. Yesterday I was in a gathering for a Khoja wedding, and the gathering was organized by the bride's side. So it was in the house, many people there. So without knowing this culture, I asked the father of the bride, I said, so where is the groom, where's the family? I don't see any one of them. He said, oh, they're not here. So then I realized, then I checked with some people, and they said, well, 5 days before the nikah or the wedding, none of the groom side are allowed to come, and the groom himself can't come at the same anywhere close to the bride. I think it's also present in the Iraqi community. They're not supposed to see each other. I asked why. They said also that they can kind of really look forward to each other.
This is all culture.
It's culture, but what's interesting is it's extended to the family as well, in the sense that the family can't come because this is a bride gathering. It's only for the bride family and their friends, which I wasn't aware of. But that's fine in the sense that, okay, this is something they've developed, but what is going on in the mindset of the youth is that they're bombarded with all these ideas, and culture has a position. It certainly has a role. Islam doesn't, for example, abolish culture at all. I was in a particular debate where we're talking about should culture comes first or religion, and I remember one sister downstairs, I think it was, she said in a gathering with lots of youth, she said, I think we should abolish this culture. We should have Islamic identity only. And I looked at her and I said, what did you eat for lunch today? She was surprised. It was being filmed. It's on TV. And she said, why are you asking me this question? I said, is there a Muslim identity food? Your food is part of your culture. It's part of your identity as well. There's nothing wrong with saying, I had Pakistani food, or I had Somalian food and things like that. Culture has a position, and actually culture has helped in many places religion flourish as well, because through cultural practices some people were adherent to faith as well. But it's a massive discussion, this. But just with regards to youth, I think we've got to be able to come up with a model or an understanding, education and awareness as to what the future holds, and how being British and Muslim and Shia or Sunni or whatever as an identity may be able to be compatible, as far as I can embrace those identities. I have to be able to understand what it means to be British, but also what it means to be Muslim, but not be at the same time be willing to somehow place anything which jeopardizes my faith as priority over my faith. But there is nothing wrong with being British Muslim or a Muslim British, so to speak. It just got to be able to balance between them and find the right means of utilizing them for our growth.
I just want to, you mentioned the future, and this is quite, I feel, a vital question. I'll try and phrase it in the best way I can. Do you feel there's now a gap that's built between the ulama and between the youth today? Do the ulama understand the youth? Do they understand the challenges that they're facing, the problems that they're facing? Are we more involved in, and I mean this with all due respect, in our centers, rather than going out and finding the youth that are not coming to the centers maybe, or that are only coming once or twice a year during Muharram or Ramadan? and this is, I feel, it's like it's building up. And from what you're saying, you know, the whole identity crisis that some youth have, and the future looking not the best. Have the ulama done enough? And could they do more?
See, I think it's so easy to blame the ulama, or to start with the ulama in this discussion. I think ulama have an important role, a very pivotal role.
I'm speaking for the youth, of course, because I'm a youth.
I know you are, and I wish I could speak on behalf of ulama, but I'm not an alim. I'm just a student, so I'm neither youth or an alim. But I could certainly say that the ulama are not perfect. So I'm not going to stand here or sit here and say, look, you know, don't blame them. But at the same time, I don't think it's fair to place all the emphasis on them. I know there's a lot of expectation from our scholars, especially those in the West, to deliver and to be role models and to lead our youth and to show them direction and to provide for them facilities to be able to, for them to spiritually grow and to really strengthen their connection and unity. But we have to maybe make a distinction between scholars who are of the first, second generation, if we consider ourselves third generation or whatever. I think there is a clear difference we have seen. From my interaction, I've seen the up-and-coming scholars who are kind of still in the youthful age, are much more willing to sit with the youth, involve themselves in sports activities, camps and retreats, lead certain organizations. Their language that they speak with the youth, the delivery of their contents in lectures and majalis and workshops and seminars, is reflective of the fact that they've lived what the youth are going through and are suffering. And so I guess there is that positive aspect that we have to remember. I think at the same time, though, maybe we lack certain, and when we talk about this idea of lacking certain things, we've got to constantly remind ourselves that we mustn't expect others to come and fill it. We should try our best to do what we can, because I think it's easy to criticize and I think it's easy to blame and to somehow expect. But today, mashallah, a lot of the youth have a great energy and facilities and the drive and the passion. And I think if you place it, ulama have got a lot of burden on their shoulders and a lot of things that they have to deliver. But what we need is out there institutions, and we need organizations that are working side by side with ulama with a clear vision and direction from the marja'iyya, from our esteemed scholars, and are able to utilize facilities to provide what is needed for our youth with consultation with the youth. What we're not seeing, unfortunately, is the identification of areas that are kind of weak or vacuums in the lives of our youngsters. I think it's just a matter of initiative out there. We need initiative. We need guidance, leadership, and direction, not only from the youth. I always say to people, people ask me a question, okay, for example, I genuinely believe one of the things that we are really lacking at the moment, especially amongst our youth, is the relationship with the Quran. If you imagine today, a lot of our youth are afraid of the Quran. Yep. They're afraid because they don't understand it. They're afraid because they can't read it. They're afraid because it's a huge ocean of something that's unknown and it's fearful. So what we are not doing is to facilitate the learning of the Quran and the development that our Muslim community can have with the Quran, and non-Muslims as well, be inspired by the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in a way that is technologically feasible in this day and age, using all kinds of modern ways to present the beautiful words of the Almighty subhanahu wa ta'ala. So when someone comes and says, we don't have a Quran institute, or we have an organization dedicated to looking at modern ways of presenting the Quran to the youth out there, okay, fair enough. But what it does need is people who are driven to say, you know what, this is a blessed project. as we have a statement, it's not a hadith, مَا كَانَ لِلَّهِ يَنْمُو, whatever you do for Allah will grow, and that's something people have seen. So if I'm sincerely doing it for the sake of Allah, let me start something off, and then I'll contact this scholar, I'll contact this person who may be an entrepreneur or a businessman, and I'll say, look, I have this great project, would you help me, would you support me? Let's start it off. And I think it's really important that youth seek initiative. One of the main concerns I have of the youth is that they came here, a lot of some of us, when we came to this country, we saw our fathers, they built mosques. They built these institutions. So we're used to things being given to us on a plate. We're not used to. I was talking to a few brothers from certain communities, and they're worried. They're worried because the donations for mosques and centers and this are coming from the older generation. Yeah. The younger generation, they're still getting the salaries. Their salaries are probably better than their forefathers or the fathers, by the way. They're getting the six-figure sums. Some of them are six-figure sums and whatever, but they're not giving. I don't want to generalize.
Of course, yeah.
But it's
a trend you've noticed.
They've somehow become more used to being given and things given to them there. Oh yeah, I've come, the mosque is there. Okay, who's going to maintain the mosque? Who's going to get the speakers? Who's going to think outside the box and start getting new ideas into our centers? Who's going to get the youth into the mosque? So all these burning questions, I think it's up to the youth themselves and those who have passed that youthful age, those in their 40s and their 50s who have lived here, for example, to sit and say, you know what, I've got to look after my children's future. I've got to do something here. And I have to consider this country, for example, as my country as well. I can't be thinking, okay, you know what, let's see what goes on in the future. And as the Iraqis say, Allah Kareem business.
Allah Kareem.
I need to build. Yeah, inshallah. Inshallah is a great thing. But so inshallah with vision, with determination, with, put your effort where your talk is, I think.
My next question I feel is quite important. And before I go into it, I just wanted to hear from yourself as well. And this is not a problem that only the youth, I think, face. It's some of our communities face these issues because of their lack of understanding, maybe of this topic, and that's the difference between a scholar and a speaker. The difference between a scholar that's spent 20, 30 years in the houser and someone that spent less time or self-taught or done summer course. So, and again, I don't want to point the finger at saying this, the scholar or the speaker or the community, but I feel that this is maybe not so much of a problem today, but it could be a problem in the future. And the example I could give is, for example, of not knowing, we say in Arabic, not knowing your size or not knowing your status when answering a question or when speaking about a certain subject.
Knowing your limits, basically.
Ahsantum. Yeah. So not knowing your limits, we say ما يعرف قدره, or his status. And that could lead into a problem because, number one, I feel that there's a huge need for English speakers today. So there's a demand. The problem is, and I studied economics for some reason in my A-levels, the supply is not enough. There's not enough English-speaking scholars that are needed around the world. I don't know the exact figures of centers in the US or the UK, but I'm guessing they're in their hundreds.
Yeah.
And I don't know the amount of speakers or scholars that there are out there that are speaking English. But if you, as I said, the supply isn't matching the demand. So we have now a problem. How can we solve this problem? Looking into the main thing that I started with, which is the difference between a scholar and the speaker.
I agree that today, due to increasing requests from communities to have English lectures, if you compare, for example, the situation now in 2019 to, for example, 2002, 2003, much more centers around the Western world, at least, and even in Africa, places of Middle East are requesting their congregation to be addressed in English. And this is because, again, globalization, again because of the diverse community members that may exist. You know, many communities today don't have just one culture or one type of community. You'll get people from different communities coming in, so a unifying language would be English. So definitely that's one of the challenges that is becoming quite evident. I believe that one of the solutions to this is to have a long-term plan, certainly, and a short-term agenda, or a devise some kind of a strategy. The long-term one is to look at how other faiths have developed and really designed a very good system to ensure that scholars with great caliber are graduating from their own seminaries and how they're being looked after. There are religious groups who basically promise those students or those people who are looking to get into these professions a salary, accommodation, a place to work, for example, and so on, from the outset, which is very enticing for for anyone to get into. Today, if you were to speak to people and to encourage them to get into Hawza, how is there a guarantee that they will be earning something at the end? Where will they be working? What is the guarantees that they will be able to remain in this field even? Some of them may graduate and then start...
Who should answer these questions? Who should be responsible for this person who's gone to Najaf or Qom for 3, 5, 10 years, studied? Who's responsible for his wage, for his accommodation? Who should be? Is it him?
I think there has to be a combined effort from centers and organizations in the West with the Hawzas to design and implement a program where these students, both male and female, by the way, because sometimes we ignore the females, and it's very, very important that we encourage them to enrich their understanding of Islam through proper education. To develop a system where they are able to somehow be guaranteed some work if they fulfill the conditions and are able to qualify, for example, after several years of study. What is also needed I spoke about this many years ago. I genuinely am a strong believer in localized houses, Western-based houses, supported by the houses of Najaf and Qom, for example.
And there are one or two.
There are one or two, but not enough. And what needs to happen is that these houses need to facilitate for different times, different occasions of the year, and at the same time have good networks with centers and so on to develop these students who enroll. What is also missing in the Western world are academies that train public speaking for our own youth. Give me one organization that does training for public speaking in the Western world for our Muslim students or Muslim brothers and sisters. You see, when I was in Najaf, I was a member of a number of organizations that represent scholars there who are khutaba. And you sit there, and there are, everywhere you walk and you see in the vicinities of the houses, there are these institutes of public speaking. There's the Sheikh Al-Wa'ili one, for example, and so on and so forth. We don't have a single one in the Western world. Today, if you have somebody who's just graduated from Hawza, of Qom and Najaf, or here in London, or in anywhere else, and they want to become a good speaker, for example, how do they develop themselves? Especially, they can go to public speaking courses generally, and it's possible that they'll get some help.
But there's no share.
But there's specific ones for our own community, our own youth. Okay, there are so many great talents out there.
I'm going to ask the same question I asked a few minutes ago. Whose responsibility is that?
It's a responsibility of the youth, the elders, the offices of the Marja'iyya, organizations that somehow lead many communities. Yes.
Some might say, if you're saying it's the responsibility of so many different groups and no one wants to take the initiative, then it's never going to happen.
Well, we have a beautiful hadith from Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam, which said that the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wasallam used to be tabibun dawarun bitibbih. So he was a doctor, a medical physician who went to look for his patients.
Allah.
Now today, if you want to go to your GP, you go to a building where your GP is sitting. GP doesn't come and look for you. Amir al-Mu'mineen says the Prophet of Islam used to look for those whom he can help and seek inspiration for. And so today we have to ask this question: where is the drive of our community and our youth? MashaAllah, we have some fantastic youth out there with great potential. See, one of the great things about youth is their energy, their passion. But sometimes they need guidance and leadership. And this guidance and leadership needs to be channeled in the right way. MashaAllah, and without taking any merit of the importance of organizing majalis, I believe it's a fantastic phenomenon that we see, especially in the Iraq community and other communities, where there is this groups of youth, different organizations coming together and holding these phenomenally successful programs. But the question that has to be asked is, organizing majalis should be the stepping stone, should be the beginning towards many, many other social services and activities that really solve the problem of our youth, as well as educational establishments and institutes and so on and so forth. I don't think we should wait for people to take initiative. I think we should do it ourselves. I genuinely believe that if you look at organizations like Who is Hussein, for example, it wasn't under a direction of a grand scholar who came and said, by the way, I want you to do this. It was a group of youth who sat together and said, you know what? Let the world know about Hussein ibn Ali, and we're going to do it. So they gathered together, they brought some kind of ideas, and look at today how many representatives they have around the world, and alhamdulillah, it's growing as an example of what can be done. The potential is great. The opportunity is there. But it's unfortunate that I find that sadly, and I'll start with myself, maybe we have apathy, maybe we have concerns. Maybe I remember being at university and looking at so many of our youth, brothers and sisters, and I see them just reserved, just want to do their education. And I come to them and say, why don't you get involved? Let's get involved in Islamic society. Let's get involved in the Ahlul Bayt society. Let's get involved in these activities. My dad and my mom told me, just stick to studying.
Get the degree in.
Get the degree out. I need to get married and have kids. Brilliant. We're not out there to say, let's not be the best. Imam Sadiq says, if there's an area and you're not the best and you're not really a Shia of Ali Muhammad, you've got to be the best. But to be the best means you need to think outside the box. You can't just be sitting, I'll get the minimum. The minimum is to get that degree. The minimum is to be out there and working. But if we're not going to change our affairs, Allah is not going to help us. إن الله لا يغير ما بقوم حتى يغير ما بأنفسهم. That has to be the inspiration for us. This verse and so many other verses. The Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam didn't just wait for someone to knock on the door. And I believe today we need that enthusiasm from amongst the youth.
I want to touch on something which is quite important, I feel. And sometimes as male speakers, not just yourself, I'm saying in general, you may get criticized on this, and that's the role of women in our communities. I'm just going to throw a few questions that I've heard or I've read on Facebook or Twitter. Till now, many communities do not have a separate hall for women where they do not see the speaker or the scholar. Now you're going to say, what's the problem, for example? Or some might say, what's the problem with that? And I would say, the same people that are organizing these programs, again, this is general, their daughters go into universities and will share the same seat or the same table with a male person. Yet in the mosque they have to be separated with their Muslim brothers when they're under supervision. So that's the first. A lot of people say that in our communities till now we don't have women in the committee. So they play no role. 3, there's no women speakers. You'll never see a woman speaker delivering a lecture to men. It's always men delivering to men and women. for even when it's when there are youthful activities that are happening, you mentioned who's Hussein, and again other organizations, I don't know the ins and outs maybe of who's, but other youth organizations, they say it's always the men leading and we're left behind. And finally, and I know I've thrown a lot of questions, but it's just things that have come to my mind. They say whenever the men scholars do want to speak about women and their role in community, it's always about hijab. And I met a speaker just recently, and he was telling me about what lectures, inshallah, he was doing for Muharram, and one of the topics he said, I really want to do hijab, but I don't want to at the same. I said, why? He said, we've rinsed this topic. And, he said, we've rinsed this topic. So all these problems, and the women feel there has been no progression, and even from the old generation, and now the youth is the same.
I feel that the whole subject of women empowerment needs its own attention and a lot of focus.
Needs a whole podcast
and awareness. Yes, because we are not people who are moving with the times. I refuse to accept this issue that because there's movements like the Me Too and all that around the world demanding equality and women's rights, all of a sudden we have to somehow abide by this or go with it. I believe that, especially in the school of Ahl Bayt and religion of Islam or in general, there is a lot of emphasis and great respect for women, and as well as that, scope for the inspirational role that women can play, given the brilliant example of Sayyidat Nisa Fatima, Sayyida Zainab, Lady Khadija, other great women in Islam. What needs to happen is education amongst our communities to start off with. I think tide is changing. Our youth are much more in line or are understanding of the potential and a great role that women can have in society. So as far as, for example, speakers are concerned, this is going to require parents to be able to kind of somehow remove these cultural shackles and be able to focus on serving the religion. The best people who will speak about the role of females and the importance that they have is they themselves, much better than people like me or you, anyone who goes out there and says Islam respects women and things like that. But there is a very interesting line of thought that's coming up now, and that's to say, why should men or women constantly talk about women's rights in Islam? It's as if
their rights have been taken away.
Obviously there's a big difference between Muslims and Islam. Yes, let's face it. People like Taliban have really misrepresented Islam in many different ways, ISIS and so on. But at the same time, women should not only be speaking, and men should not only be speaking about issues to do with these matters. And I think we need to kind of step back as well. It's a good point that some are making, that, look, stop just talking about women's rights and things like that. Let's talk generally as well and include women in all the discussions as to what roles they can have in society. I've been an advocate of more women speakers. I've said it in many majalis that we need to develop and encourage our sisters to attend houses and seminaries and be in important positions. I think there's a lot of scope there to do. And in many organizations, you see some of our sisters, mashallah, the most active, really leading by example in many ways. But perhaps what we need to also say at this juncture, that we are very much keen and very much supportive of the push to ensure that they are represented at committee levels of our mosques, not just to be in charge of women's affairs, because some of the brothers would say, yes, we have sisters in our committee, but they look after women's programs. No, it should not only about women's programs. They should be involved in other decision-making processes as well. And all these aspects as well to encourage education. All this is great. But at the same time, there is a movement that is pushing for liberal ideas and thoughts, which is problematic, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He is a wise creator. He has given each and every creation of his traits, abilities, skills, in accordance with many things that they can achieve. And I think sometimes the roles of men and women are confused many times. Islam is very much for women to be at the workplace. There's nothing wrong with our sisters being out there leading by example with the Islamic modest clothing of hijab. But at the same time, their role as a mother, which cannot be
done by
replaced or somehow fulfilled
by anyone else.
A father or anyone else, must not be taken for granted. I want to pick up on a point you mentioned, a really critical point, and that is, people saying, oh, lectures about hijab, we've rinsed it, we've done this. Just maybe the way we've presented Islam and the teachings of Islam through the minbar needs to be rethought, and the terminology we have used and the styles and the methods that we have developed
interesting,
maybe
nice way of putting it, Sheikh.
Too uncomfortable, sometimes extreme. Let me elaborate on this. In Arabic, we have this thing called al-khitab ad-dini, which is translated as the style of the content, the style of the message that we are presenting, and as far as religious teachings are concerned. As people who have been blessed and truly given this wonderful responsibility of propagating the message of the religion of Islam as taught by the Holy Prophet and the Ahl al-Bayt, peace and blessings be upon them all, we have to understand that we don't live in a world where people will take it easy when I sit there on an elevated place and say, you have to do this. If you don't, you're going to be punished like this, or how dare you, and things like that. Even raising the voice and projecting and using certain terminology may be putting people away or pushing people away from the religion. And we have a silent majority of the youth who may be not attending the mosque or programs. Maybe they come for Muharram only. They're watching a bit of YouTube here and there when they get moments where they want to get closer to Allah, whatever. They want that inspiration. But how are we presenting religion to them? How are they, getting this Quran and Ahl al-Bayt information and knowledge? Is it something that's making them think, wow, this is something that's really going to change my life? Or is it, for example, God forbid, just scaremongering, using fear language, punishment, dark, that kind of thing? What image of God the Almighty are we giving to our children?
Interesting.
How are we raising our youngsters, our daughters, our sons? In which, now, I understand that maybe back in the time, or even our forefathers and so on, there was a style that they were accustomed to. There was a methodology that they developed, and that's the only way that they would practice religion. But today, maybe this khitab ad-dini, the style and the methodology of delivering of religion, needs to be reformed. And this is where not only should majalis and lectures need to be re-looked at in terms of how we're presenting this knowledge, but also utilizing all the other ways that we have at our disposal. I'm a very big advocate and a big supporter of workshops and courses and dialogues, and what today people talk about known as something called andragogy as opposed to pedagogy. Pedagogy is when you walk and you talk down to people the way we speak to our kids. But andragogy is the way I'm talking to you now. I'm looking at you at the same eye level, we're having a conversation, and learning tends to take place much, much better when it's andragogic, okay, rather than pedagogic. So this is something that we need to develop. This is something that really is a burning need going forward in as far as tabligh is concerned and presenting the message of Islam is concerned, and something we have to make a priority in all, and something maybe speakers, scholars, institutions and thinkers should be constantly pushing, should be constantly having a discussion about how can I improve my style of delivery, my content of delivery, what am I choosing, what are the areas that I should be focusing on for the development of the Muslim Western person who's living in these countries facing all these challenges. This is key for our development as a community.
You mentioned the delivering of the majlis, the delivering of the lecture, and that's quite important. We're coming up in the next, maybe I think in 4 weeks, we've got Muharram. First of all, how do you, and this is for you to answer, so how do you prepare your topics for Muharram, especially the 12 nights, the first 10 or 12 nights? And I feel it's important now because of YouTube, because of TV, because these lectures are not just now directed to the people sitting in the mosque, even if it's 500, 1,000, 1,500 people sitting in the mosque, that you've got now a wider audience. Do you put that lens on where when you prepare your topics, are you delivering it to the center? Of course, I know you're not, because now the lectures go on YouTube, and
yeah.
So there's a wider audience. How do you pick your topics then? Because that makes it even now more difficult, because if you're, for example, maybe, I don't know, some Pakistani communities will have different issues to some Iraqi problems to the Khojas. They all have different. So how do you pick your topics for Muharram? And where, have you picked your topics for this Muharram first?
Yes.
10 topics, 12 topics you've got ready.
Yes. Alhamdulillah, half of them are done.
Okay.
I'm working towards the other half.
Inshallah.
So I guess it differs between speakers, and I think it's about identification of what is required, needs of the community, and the strength of the speaker themselves. You see, sometimes we have to come out of our comfort zones. There are areas that we love to talk about. There are areas that we feel we're strong, but at the same time, we've got to understand the needs of the time as well. And yes, there's a wide, diverse crowd that you normally address. And Muharram is a special time. And obviously, there are people who come to Muharram Majalis who may not come for the rest of the year.
Mm-hmm.
So you need to utilize this wonderful opportunity that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us. And a lot of progression and development has happened through Muharram Majalis. This is why it's emphasized so much by the Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam. Because people's lives have been changed in Muharram. It is a great chance to touch the lives of these individuals. And a lot of the times, something that it's not mentioned, but it's a chance for ourselves to change ourselves as well.
Nice.
It's a wonderful opportunity to re-look at ourselves, because sometimes when you're preparing for these majalis, you think, okay, am I going to really emphasize on this point and I'm not really practicing it as much? Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu lima taquluna ma la taf'alun. Allah bless the soul of Sheikh Abbas al-Qummi, as he said, as you know, he was about to publish the Mafatih al-Jinan, but he held back because he decided to practice everything in there before he published it, which is a phenomenal thing. In Mafatih al-Jinan, it's just there, I've seen it. So it's amazing that, some of our scholars have emphasized this idea that I have to walk the walk and talk the talk at the same time. So, in these areas, I think this is one limitation where you look at this and you think, wow, if I talk about lowering the gaze and I'm not lowering the gaze as much, it will be hypocritical. I can't do it. And it's so important because, this is not a job that we're assessed by the people. It is something that we are assessed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and by Imam Sahib al-Asr wa Zaman, Ajjallahu ta'ala farajah, whom we have to believe is sitting in the crowd. And who's going to tell us, look, I was sitting in a crowd. Why did you say that? Why did you mention this hadith in the incorrect context?
So testing time for the speaker or the scholar as well.
It's a massive time.
Yeah.
Every speech is an examination and a trial for all of us. But specifically Muharram, because the subject of Imam Hussein alayhi salam and the whole epic story of Ashura touches our hearts so passionately, and it means so much to all of us. The Marji'iyya constantly encourage the speakers, the ulama, to be avoiding topics that cause division in the community, to unite the community as much as possible, and not to talk about, for example, slandering this person or attacking this individual, but rather nourishing the souls of the people. Remembering that these people have come from work, they're looking for that inspiration. They're looking, I sometimes look at those people sitting there and, looking at me, and I sometimes imagine them telling me somehow, hit me with something. Give me something that I'm going to go home now and think, you know what? That meant so much to me.
I'm going to change something in my life.
Maybe.
Yeah.
If across those 10, 12 nights, something was said that makes them think, we've done our job. We've done our job. So yes, the type of community you speak to does make a slight difference, but like you said, it is a global village now. And sometimes we've got to look at a wide range of topics to try and, you know, ensure that we don't lose a certain group who are not interested in history or spirituality or akhlaq, but try to have an integrated approach as much as possible to bring these topics together in a very presentable manner, so that it's enticing for our community.
I'm looking forward to your lecture, Sheikh. Just give us one topic. I know you don't usually like to give away. What should we look forward to?
I can't give you a topic.
Hit me with something. Hit me with something, Sheikh.
Well, you know, inshallah, this Muharram will be the first time that I'm going to do a series.
Oh, interesting.
And it's a series that I've researched, and I could not find any single English lecture in YouTube or anywhere else on this series.
Interesting. Okay,
so
I look forward to it.
It's something, hopefully, for the first time.
The lectures will be on YouTube on the same day, inshallah?
On the same day. And I've done a lot of research on this topic. Okay. It's going to be, inshallah, I hope and I pray to Allah.
You haven't hit me with something yet. I need that.
Well, that's it. I'm hitting you with anticipation. I'm hitting you with this anticipation. But I guess what we have to always remember is that generally, when we're having these discussions about Muharram, about vision of the community, about our youth, about the future, all this, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is with us. Allah tabarak wa ta'ala blesses us. We have to rely on Him. We have to have tawfiq. But above all, we have to have sincerity. We have to do this for His sake. We have to go into all these projects and initiatives and ideas with the complete 100% determination that we're doing it for His sake, because otherwise it's definitely something that will fail. And we pray to Him subhanahu wa ta'ala that tawfiq, that blessing, that acceptance of deeds is bestowed upon us, and then we can truly serve. That's what we really intend to do. That service to mankind is so noble, and inshallah we can be inspired and inspire each other. وَتَوَاصَوْا بِالْحَقِّ وَتَوَاصَوْا بِالصَّبْرِ. We can help each other to fulfill goals that we will definitely please Allah and help mankind, inshallah. Finally,
Sheikh, as the whole community came together during the holy month of Ramadan, when they heard the news of your eldest son Hadi, alhamdulillah, I spoke to you as well about it. I said, this is the first time I've seen the community come together for a purpose, and that was the dua for your son Hadi. Not a lot of people have direct contact to you, maybe. I'm very lucky enough to know you as a friend and the older brother, so I have contact with you directly. I can ask you, but a lot of people are wondering, how is the health of Hadi? If you can update us on this.
Alhamdulillah, I'm absolutely grateful, above all, without comparison, to the Almighty subhanahu wa ta'ala. His grace, His mercy, His blessings are so abundant, and cannot be thankful enough to Him, Jalla wa ala, for all that He's provided for us. And of course, the community has been fantastic, great support. The month of Ramadan was difficult because Hafiz had to cancel the commitment and the lectures in America and a few nights in East Africa, in Mombasa. But the community were brilliant in their support, their du'as, their well wishes. And I think this helped a lot psychologically and also for the health of my son as well. Alhamdulillah, he's going through the chemotherapy with its all challenges, good days and some challenging days, I would call them. And inshallah, he's very positive, he's very hopeful, he's determined to fight it off. And inshallah, with the continuous du'as of the mu'mineen, mu'minat, he'll be able to overcome this. And I told him personally that this is a great moment in his life to be able to utilize it, inshallah, for him to achieve excellence in life, inshallah. Because going through a condition like this for many people at the later stages in life is difficult. But if you go through it as a child, as a 12-year-old, and inshallah you come out of it, then it really sets the scene for your life, because you've gone through this really difficult thing that most people won't go through in their lives. So you're in a good, it's as if you've passed this very advanced driving course that only the police do, because you need it in your life. So you've really passed this amazingly tough examination. So then inshallah throughout his life he'll be able to utilize this for the excellence in all aspects, inshallah, that he can achieve, and maybe even help others who go through similar conditions or difficulties, trials and hardship, and inspire them to look at the positives of it and come out a better person, inshallah.
Inshallah. Well, we're here at the Progeny team. We'll continue to make dua for him. Our listeners, our viewers, inshallah, will continue in the du'as for Hadi and a speedy recovery, inshallah. At this difficult time, inshallah, we wish you and your family all the best, inshallah, and all the tawfiq. And I'd like to once again thank you for making time. I know you're going to
pleasure.
Thank you for making time to come on the Progeny, and inshallah we'll see you very soon.
Inshallah. Thank you. Alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.